Okay, let us go ahead and get started. So first, a quick note to the undergraduates in the course. As you have seen, we have given out our first writing assignment. Some of you might think this is cruel and unusual punishment to ask you to write something so early and quickly. We do so not to be mean and cruel. We do so because we want you to be getting into this material and then hopefully getting some hopefully helpful feedback from us from your initial thoughts. So as you have seen, again, this is only to the undergraduates, these are very, to put it mildly, open-ended questions dealing with two issues that have arisen thus far in the course. We put them in an open-ended way to give you the freedom to think through these materials. So as you've probably gotten a sense from Roberto and I in our approach to this course, we want you to think big. These are not research papers, these are thought pieces. Feel free to be provocative and hopefully showing us that you're beginning to try to wrestle with these issues. We will be reading them along those lines. We simply want to be sure that you are pushing yourself to think big in this course. So this is our intentionally kept very short. We say 3 to 6 pages. Oftentimes people will think, oh, if it's 3 to 6 pages, I better write 6 pages in really small print to show I care. No, 3 pages is honestly fine. We honestly mean that. It's a wide range, but a short number regardless, because a provocation need not go on at great length. You're welcome to go on at greater length, only 6 pages, but a 3-page provocation is fine. We just want to help encourage you to be thinking about these issues. Several of you have already reached out to talk to me. I'm, of course, more than happy to do so, not just the undergraduates, but just to all of you here to know, yes, this is just a provocation. Please take it in that spirit, and we very much look forward to hearing your responses. So, let me actually pause for a quick moment. Any questions about this opening assignment from the undergraduates, obviously? Okay, good. Well, we very much look forward to hearing your responses to this. And let me now begin by stating a general framework that will largely be guiding us for the rest of the course. In truth, has already been guiding us, but I put it this way because, of course, we began the course last week by discussing what has now become the dominant approach to ethical philosophy in at least the Anglo-American world, although it's now a very significant global movement too. And we're arguing that we should really see this, that entire approach, as coming out of a certain moment in European history that itself was based upon a reading with all sorts of implications of the Christian tradition. From here on, we will be continuing to look at different readings of the different traditions, but we will also be trying to give counter readings that we hope will open up new possibilities. So to underline something said relatively briefly in our first class, think of this extraordinary period that opens up something like 6th century BCE, closing something around the 8th century of the Common Era, as one of those moments when you get an extraordinary willingness to rethink the entire world. The incredible opening of these prophetic moments, which was argued have never been closed. It's simply we are more willing to make them and more willing to listen at certain moments. As we noted, this emerges after the end of literally a 3-millennium run of these Bronze Age aristocratic cultures that dominated Eurasia. When these begin breaking down in the 1st millennium BCE, you get the explosion of these philosophical and religious movements. In Greece, this is when you, of course, get Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. In South Asia, this is when you get the Upanishads, Jainism, the Buddha. In China, this is when you get Confucius, Lao Tzu, Mengzi, or Mencius as it's been put into English. These incredible moments, which, as we have mentioned, is often discussed in the secondary literature according to the term axial age movements, a term, as we have argued, that is a bit dangerous, to put it politely. That term was developed by a figure called Karl Jaspers at right after World War II, trying to argue that Enlightenment values, in other words, Enlightenment that arose in European 18th century, should not be thought of as simply a European 18th century development. It is part of a universal development of all of humankind that has its first moment in this period that he then terms the Axial Age, saying in 6th, 5th, 4th centuries BCE, this is when, for the first time, he claimed, humans begin developing transcendental notions of what it would mean to live an enlightened life, and he's really thinking of this as being the equivalent of 18th century philosophers that he's simply placing earlier in time and then making global. The danger of that is, as we mentioned very briefly in our first class, is that it predisposes us to reading them in, well, those lines as being simply philosophers coming up with kind of slight variations of what we have come to know as Enlightenment thinking. Needless to say, given the arguments of this course, we would read the Enlightenment as one way of reading the Christian tradition with great powers but weaknesses, and part of the reason we want to look at other moments, or rather in this case going back to what he would call the same moment, but not reading them along that paradigm, is we should be open to radically different conceptions than anything that would have ever been seen as remotely acceptable in 18th century Europe. If Karl Jaspers is globalizing that vision, our view is, well, let us explode that vision. And the rest of the course will consist of doing so. As we have mentioned, we will not be, sadly, for lack of time, discussing all of these, but what we will be doing is picking and choosing moments that have both been incredibly historically influential on the world in which we currently live, and we will be giving counter readings of these traditions to open up other possibilities, encouraging all of you to hopefully do the same. Now, when we say we want to therefore explode this notion of the Axial Age period, part of that explosion is the way I mentioned. We want to break it out of a vision that you simply had a lot of the equivalents of Enlightenment thinkers earlier and more globally. We also want to explode this in terms of a time horizon. Karl Jaspers, and this would be predictable from what we've said so far, would never have included the salvific religions that come toward, well, a few centuries later, that come in those first few centuries of the Common Era. As we noted in our first class, when that period, what he did call the Axial Age religions, are sort of stopped by the formation of these huge Iron Age empires across Eurasia, the Roman Empire, the Mauryan Empire, and the Han Empire. Those empires, when they begin to falter, you get a radicalization of these earlier mid-first millennium BCE movements in the forms of Christianity, Mahayana Buddhism, radical forms of religious Taoism that take a lot of these ideas and radicalize them. For Karl Jaspers, he says very little about these movements because, of course, they do not at all fit his vision of the equivalent of Enlightenment thinkers, but we absolutely want to include them. This is, we will argue very clearly, a continuation of this exact same powerful prophetic set of movements. Those movements were, of course, as we have already begun to see, then domesticated very, very strongly by later institutional orders. Going on the western side of Eurasia, because we'll be beginning today with Christianity, that form took the institutionalization of what, as we noted before, was called the Great Chain of Being throughout the Middle Ages. That vision being, God, it was claimed, created an absolute hierarchy of the entire world. Everything was born into a pre-given place within this great chain. That includes all humans who had a pre-given place in a pre-given social hierarchy, aristocrat, peasant, and the whole range in between. And your goal, according to this reading, was to live your role properly. That, needless to say, is not what we will see as the more powerful side of Christianity we could read from. We have seen another domestication as well. And now, just to put this in larger context. So, beginning in the early modern period, you get secularized Protestant versions of Christianity, which take the form, as we noted last week, of claiming, let us think of every single individual as the equivalent of God, but the equivalent meaning simply every individual is a sovereign. That sovereign has power over a set of resources that we will call his, and it's almost exclusively his, property. And then we will try to create rules that will argue why these sovereigns should exist with each other and not try to kill each other. This will involve, ethically, trying to argue that they should have altruistic ways of dealing with each other, breaking down the inherent selfishness that would come from thinking you're a sovereign and this is my property and I will try to get more property at the expenses of others who think of themselves as sovereigns, and broken down institutionally by saying we will create things like market economies where you can buy and sell at hopefully a relatively equal exchange your properties for other properties, but you create a legal framework wherein that is seen as legitimate. You create things like political systems that will come to be called democracies, in which different sovereigns can join together into interest groups and try to win in the marketplace of the political sphere. And then later, as we mentioned, moving into the 19th century, with people like Bentham, the argument will be, and on top of both of those, we also need states that will be making decisions outside of the democratic process for the larger social good based upon a utilitarian calculus. So that utilitarian calculus will say, well, sometimes you need more of a redistribution of wealth than the population is ever likely to approve. You need to rethink how we do things like punishments and the building of prisons at levels that would, again, often go beyond what would ever be approvable by a likely democratic process. All of these were attempts to say, let's build a world of sovereign individuals interacting in a market economy with democratic principles so they can form interest groups and a state that can make larger scale decisions based upon utilitarian principles. And as we noted, all of the ethical philosophies that have now become dominant in the Anglo-analytic tradition basically come out of those three moves. Those are basically philosophical versions of those three moves that arose in the early modern period. And as we noted, the reason it seems so perfectly natural to discuss ethical issues in terms of how people will be on a life raft and debate amongst themselves according to these rational principles is because we live in a world where social theory itself operates exactly along those lines, and we live in a world where that social theory operates along those lines because we live in an institutional order that is so arranged. That, getting back to the key point, is one secularized rereading of the Christian tradition, one that has become so predominant we largely take it for granted. Are there other ways of reading the Christian tradition? Needless to say, and we'll begin with this beginning today, absolutely. And let me just briefly lay out some of these, powerfully and not. So another way of reading the tradition that will also be very influential and often form a critique of everything we just mentioned will be to focus on Christian visions of history that you then secularize. That vision goes along the following lines. If in Christianity you have a notion of an Eden at the beginning of the world where humans live in flawless harmony with the natural world, then with the original sin, humans break from that, are alienated from each other and the world. You then have the progress of human history that will then culminate in a final end when you have the second coming, and in that second coming, once again, a perfect home will be found, but not on earth, in heaven, for all humans now once again perfectly merged with each other and with the larger cosmos. The secularized version of that begins to set in, again in Europe, in the 19th century. One of the most powerful and influential thinkers is, of course, Hegel, who we're asking you to read some today. Hegel's secularized version of this goes along the following lines. At some point in distant antiquity, and he himself over the course of a career will locate this in different places, but he certainly won't call it Eden, nonetheless, humans were perfectly connected to each other and the cosmos. However, according to Hegel, what breaks this is not an original sin. Or you could say so, but in his opinion, this was right to occur. What breaks this is humans were correctly trying to seek knowledge, understanding, and yes, control over the world. So the equivalent of eating the apple is presented by Hegel as a necessary move by attempts by humans to not simply be a part of the cosmic order, but begin to understand and control the world. That then creates the alienation that we know from the fall story, now secularized. Human history consists of that alienation in which humans, now alienated from each other and the world, begin working through various attempts to reconnect with each other and with the world. Those attempts, each limited and failing, create a dialectic where one position will emerge, it will fail, another position will emerge, and at best, they will be brought together for a new synthesis, which will open up yet another set of problems. All of human history should be read this way, but again, as a secularized version of the Christian narrative, there will be an end time where absolutely humans will find again a perfect connection with themselves and the larger world. Hegel, and we'll see this is a characteristic moment for many such thinkers, thought he was not only about to live in such a world, he thought he was actually living in it. It turns out, you'll be happy to know, that moment was the Prussian state of the early 19th century. He later actually came along and said, no, I was wrong. That wasn't quite the perfect moment. But it is a characteristic move to say, we are about to achieve this or already have, and in his case, that already have meant the following. At the moment where we have done so, it means you have sovereign individuals, yes, with full knowledge of themselves and the world and an ability to control it. But unlike the early modern thinkers we were discussing last week, in this vision, the ultimate endpoint will be a correct giving up of that pure sovereignty, because you will see yourself correctly as part of a larger whole that nonetheless will still include an absolute understanding of the world around you and an ability to manipulate it without being alienated from it. The argument being that what would later come to be called over the course of the 19th century modernity was the moment when all of this would be possible. And for Hegel, this is simply a secularized version of the Christian narrative story, the fall from Eden and the final moment. But again, it's going to be fulfilled here on earth, not by a second coming and not in heaven. Needless to say, the variations of that way of thinking, always presented as a critique of that early modern vision, continues to take various forms. Marx will, of course, argue that no, it was certainly not the Prussian state, that final moment is still to come with communism, but he felt what Hegel was describing was a crucial stage because things would get so bad in this bourgeois order that will propel the moment toward what will be the final period on Earth when the final stage is achieved. Perhaps most laughable in all of these attempts is the one that actually did try to reconcile the vision that arose from early modern Europe of sovereign individuals with this narrative, which of course is the now infamous one propelled by Francis Fukuyama in 1989, where he argued the end of history actually was achieved, and it was achieved in neoliberal America in 1989, where the final vision of the final understanding of humanity was achieved, which turned out to be the capitalistic version of America at that time, with the form of democracy it had invented at that time. It turns out that was the final moment, the final endpoint of history, and so now all of the rest of history will simply consist of people living within, and happily so by definition, this perfect order, where it turns out the sovereign order of the early modern period had finally been worked out into its perfect form. So you have a merging, he thought, between a purely market economy and a Hegelian vision that it turns out to have been one and the same in 1990. Wasn't that nice? So that entire vision comes out of yet another secularized version of the Christian narrative. And let me then mention yet another possible way of reading the tradition as a segue to our main discussion for today. What if, on the contrary, we were not fully convinced by either of the strands that we have been discussing? Are there other ways you could build out a secularized reading of Christianity? And to do so, are there other aspects of the Christian tradition one could focus on? You will not be surprised to hear our answer is going to strongly be yes. And today we are going to be discussing two of those, which have slightly appeared in the other two versions we've mentioned, but not in the ways that we think are the most powerful. So, to begin with one, we mentioned last week this vision of sovereign individuals who will be brought together under visions, ethically speaking, of altruism, or institutionally market economies or democratic processes, all of which is to say, you maintain your sovereignty, but learn to deal with others as best you can without killing them. That vision, which would be again called altruism in the ethical traditions, builds out of a secularized vision of Christian love. What if, on the contrary, we took that vision of love seriously and didn't try to domesticate it into a notion of altruism of competing sovereign entities? What would that look like? What would it look like if we took the notion of incarnation and divine infinity seriously? In other words, not in the form of every individual is a sovereign little deity controlling their own cosmos, and that cosmos is their property. What if, on the contrary, we were to ask, what would it mean if we really wanted to say, as with the incarnation, but now in a secularized form, that humans have within them divine powers, not divine in the sense of omnipotence and omniscience, obviously, but divine in the sense of an infinity that goes beyond their own limited circumstances. And instead of domesticating that to a notion of sovereignty over property, we try to take it seriously. Now, has this route been attempted? Sure. We will be discussing a little bit today, and especially in 3 weeks, those attempts you will see in Romanticism, picked up by people like Nietzsche and radicalized, which will say, yes, we will take that and run with it, but the danger, as we will see repeatedly, is it does not form a kind of sense of how these creatures, these radically divinized creatures, would be able to get along, because again, they're wiping out altruism. However, what you get is variations of what you might predict. Either this sense on the romantic side of these endless rebellions against established order, I am more divine, I am more infinite than these finite circumstances, which means at our greatest moments we're endlessly in revolt, but the problem is you can't be endlessly in revolt. And what about the people who are not endlessly in revolt? Are they just less divine? And the implication would be, well, yeah, they are. And so it ends up being an elite few always in rebellion against an established order that actually has to exist for the endless rebellion to continue. So it is always a doomed enterprise. Or you take the radicalized version of Nietzsche that we'll be reading in detail in 3 weeks, which is to say, I will simply argue that the figures, there might at any given time be no more than one, and they don't even appear often, but this is the Übermensch, the Superman, the Overman, the figures who will every once in a while arise, who will give a vision to the world that everyone else will accept. In other words, really becoming a divinity, not a divinity with other divinities with their as sovereign entities with property, but a truly divine figure here on earth. And we certainly know historically the dangers of that view, and we will discuss it at length in 3 weeks. So our question for today is, could we build on these ideas of love and infinity in ways that avoid these 3 secularization attempts, also keeping it secular, but one that would open up as opposed to close off possibilities, as with the notion of a sovereign bourgeois individual, or avoid the tremendous dangers of the Nietzschean approach? first the Romantic, but then in its extreme form, the Nietzschean approach. Our argument will be yes, and we will begin that conversation here today by trying to sketch out what that would mean, and then just looking forward to the rest of the course. We will do comparable things when we move to South Asia, when we ask about very different views that also arose in this time span, beginning with the Buddha himself, midway through the first millennium BCE, and the explosion of Mahayana Buddhism a few centuries later. We will also ask, what are the powers of that tradition? How has it been domesticated? What possibilities exist? And then, of course, we will turn to the eastern side of Eurasia and do the exact same thing with the ideas coming out of Confucianism, asking, what are the powers? How has it been domesticated? How would we reread the tradition to open up possibilities for the future? So, with that as a general introduction to where we have been, where we are going, and how to situate our discussion of today, let us now turn to that material. And to do so, let me turn to Roberto.
Thank you, Michael. So I want to offer a series of propositions about Christianity, and I'm going to stop all along the way so we can discuss it as we go along. But let me first make a remark about the whole discussion. Many of the greatest achievements of our civilization, like, for example, the plays of Shakespeare or the philosophy of Hegel, have this characteristic that they are unthinkable without Christianity, but that at the same time they are not Orthodox Christian. The plays of Shakespeare flirt at many points with heresy, with apostasy, and so does the philosophy of Hegel. And as I proceed in this part-by-part discussion, that observation is an anxiety in the back of my mind, because I have to ask myself whether the same thing applies to my argument about Christianity, of whether it too is heretical in some way. But I think this has to do with the enormous power of Christianity, of the Christian vision, as if it were a bomb that kept exploding over time, and the depths of which we have not yet plumbed. Now, the first set of propositions returns to something I said in an earlier class. What is the proto-philosophy, the elementary view of the world that Christianity seems to imply or require? Not a system, because we have systems in the history of Christianity. The most influential was Aristotle, the Greek philosophy of being. And the Christianity that we received is a Christianity filtered through this Greek philosophy of being, and therefore probably heretical. For example, because the philosophy of being says being is higher than person. The impersonal is higher than the personal. But for Christianity, the personal is higher than the impersonal, clearly, and so forth. So the first proposition in this proto-philosophy is the most important fact about the world, about the universe, is that it is what it is rather than something else. Its character cannot be inferred from rational necessity. It has a brute facticity, a radical contingency, which is part of its nature. So it cannot be the subject of an allegory. It's not as if behind it there was some rational scheme which we could decode. It is itself. The second fact is that time is real. It's not true, contrary to the Greek philosophy of being, that the world has an elementary structure, a structure of elementary constituents, and that this structure is in turn governed by immutable laws. Time is real in the sense that nothing is outside of time. Everything changes in the world, including change itself. The ways in which things change also change. The third proposition is that the new is possible. The world, natural history, is the scene of the constant creation of novelty, not predicted or not governed by prior law. The fourth proposition is that history is open. History has no script. The script of history has not been written. We write it in the form of conflict, of practical and visionary conflict. The fifth proposition is that the individual human being has unfathomable depth, and is for that very reason obscure to himself and to other human beings. We are obscure to ourselves and to one another because we cannot reach the bottom of the personality. The infinite is within us. The sixth proposition is that the ordinary, the prosaic, the banal has more promise and more value than the noble and the extraordinary. That it is through the elevation of ordinary humanity and ordinary experience that we will reach the heights of the divine. Everything in our experience points beyond itself. And now I want to add a seventh proposition. The seventh proposition is that in the conduct of our lives, the maxim that we should obey is look for trouble. And this maxim is the very opposite of the maxim of the ancient wisdom of the Greeks and the Romans. Keep out of trouble. The maxim is cannot be serenity. If the Redeemer sought crucifixion, how can we seek to remain serene? So this isn't really a philosophical system, but it already suffices, despite its generality, to exclude most of the powerful philosophical ideas and systems in the history of thought. And that already begins to locate Christianity in a certain space. Now let me stop there and ask whether you would like to comment on that, Michael, before I go on.
So I will give my comment in the form of a commentary of what Roberto is doing here. So note in all of the ways that we have been discussing so far, where Christianity is being secularized, all attempts that, as we have noted, that we are quite critical of, the move has always been to largely take Christianity along the lines of what we know Christianity to have become in its institutionalized form, and then you're picking and choosing as to which part of that you want to secularize. So again, do you want to secularize the idea of divinity with each bourgeois individual being the equivalent with a property? Do you want to secularize the notion of the fall from Eden and the final culmination and secularize that within the form of human history? Do you want to attempt to secularize the notion of a divine human but in a romanticized form, or again the form more extreme of a Nietzsche? All of which is largely assuming the form of Christianity as we have come to know it in its institutionalized form, and picking and choosing. Note what Roberto is on the contrary doing. He is arguing even the form of Christianity that we have come to know in its institutionalized form, that is already, he will be arguing, an heretical vision that is actually already pushing against some of its most powerful tenets, that even the attempt to build a Christianity based upon Greek notions of being is already a radical limitation of the powers of it, already claiming that there is, in fact, this pre-given narrative going from Eden to the second coming is actually an heretical movement of the fact that working out of this tradition, you would see the radical openness and contingency of history if that is the piece that you are developing a secularized vision from. And we will see the entire argument when we get to the key issues of love and infinity, he will do along the following lines. So note, not just this is a different way of reading a secularized Christianity, it's an entirely different way of actually doing that very work. So, as a small commentary to what you're up to, let us return.
So my second set of remarks has to do with what I'm going to call the scandals of reason. Christianity, of course, is not just a philosophy or a proto-philosophy. It's a dramatic narrative of creation and redemption, of God's saving intervention in human history. And when translated into this narrative, it then produces what I'm going to call these scandals. So the first is the scandal of supernaturalism. That the story of creation and redemption implies, at many points along the way, the supersession, the suspension of the normal causal connections in the world. Of course, the miraculous activity of Christ, his virginal birth, the resurrection of the body, and so forth. But the whole history of divine intervention is full of these suspensions. And how are we to understand this? Of course, the standard problem of counterfactual explanation, when we say we suspend such and such causal connections, the question is, well, what happens to the rest? Does the rest stay the same or not? Because once you pluck out part of the causal thread, maybe the whole thread begins to unravel. So that's the first scandal of reason. The second scandal of reason is the scandal of particularity. There is a universal message brought by Christianity to humanity, but the universal message is carried by a particular plot. How can the particularity of the plot be reconciled with the universality of the message? Why did God become incarnate in the person of a Palestinian zealot in a peripheral province of the Roman Empire at a particular time in human history? Why not earlier, where he might have brought salvation to more people, or later when his message might have been better received, and so forth? This too is perplexing, a perplexing mystery. How the universality of the message can be reconciled with the particularity of the narrative. The third scandal is the most fundamental, and this is the scandal of the incomprehensibility of God. What is the conception of God in this religion, and indeed in all these Semitic monotheisms, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam? It seems that God can't really just be a person. That's an anthropomorphic concept of God, in which we reduce God to our own dimension. God cannot be a being, the God of the philosophers, the God of Aristotle. Because the conception is that humanity interacts with itself. Human beings interact with one another on the analogy of how they interact with God. The third conception of God is the negative one, the via negativa, in the mystical countercurrents of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. God as non-being and non-person, pure negation. And of course, pure negation is a confession of intellectual impotence, a failure in accounting for the existence of God. So this is like an inverse of the ontological existence of God that I'm suggesting by this third scandal of reason. The ontological existence of God treated fallaciously the existence of God as one of his attributes and said, to be perfect, God must exist. One of his attributes must be his existence. That was supposedly a way of proving the existence of God. The philosophers, especially from Kant on, or even from St. Anselm on, denounced the ontological proof of the existence of God as specious. This is the opposite of the ontological existence of God. How can God exist if he can't even be conceived? And we might add to those three scandals of reason a fourth scandal, which is of a completely different nature, namely that most of the believers in the world, including most of the Christians, are believers and are Christians because their parents were. And how can that not be a discrediting fact of religious faith? So again, let me stop and ask for your comment, Michael.
Absolutely, which I will again give in the form of a commentary to the way Roberto is developing his argument. Note, in contrast to what we were discussing before, the way the argument is being laid out. So we mentioned before Karl Jaspers, this figure who comes up with this idea of the axial age religions. Now again, he's not talking about Christianity because they don't fit the model, but note how he has to reread even the people he is reading to make them fit. Basically, the approach is you take out all of the stuff that wouldn't make sense to a vision of Enlightenment rationality, which, as we will see as we go through the course, is most of what these thinkers actually were talking about. Little of it fits. But when you read Karl Jaspers, you're reading about the Buddha, and he comes off like, oh yes, he wants us to rethink the world around us by understanding there's a larger transcendental vision. Well, yeah, he did say that, as we'll see. He also said we should destroy the self and destroy the entire artificial world we've built through it. So it's a radically different vision, but the hermeneutical move is you simply reduce all of that to something that makes perfect sense to a modern rational thinker. Or, to give a version of the secularization moves that we were discussing, where there you say, okay, we will talk about Christianity, unlike a Jaspers, and we will certainly admit that Christianity includes a lot of things that would strain a definition of Enlightenment rationality, but that's where we make the secularization argument. So we'll just take those out. So the argument would be, how do you deal with the idea of a divinity who will come down and break the natural laws by intervening in human history? Well, the standard move in early modern Europe is to say, well, no. The way we'll put it is God, whether he existed or not, created, but according to what the Christian view would be, God created a world governed by natural laws, so we will either take God out or call God simply that beginning force, but now, thereafter, we just have natural laws, period. So he doesn't come down anymore, so we take out that weird part. Or how do you deal with the fact that...
So he makes the machine and then vanishes.
Precisely. He makes the machine, vanishes, and therefore when we make the secularization move, we take out the difficult to understand part. The part that doesn't fit our sense of reason disappears. So we simply are governed by natural laws, period. How do we deal with the fact that Christianity will have a revelation coming down in the middle of the first century of the Common Era of the Roman Empire, and this very poor person in a province of the Roman Empire of all things? As Roberto said, why not proclaim it at the beginning of the world, or why not give it to an emperor so that it can be proclaimed immediately? How do you deal with that from secularization? Well, again, the way you do it is you say, well, Jesus was simply a great philosopher, and philosophers arise where philosophers arise, but it's got nothing to do with a divine incarnation. So again, in the secularization move, you take out all of the parts that don't fit our vision of what should be a proper rationalized understanding of the world. And note, on the contrary, Roberto's move is to say, no, let's take those seriously. Not seriously in the sense that we're going to necessarily support, and you'll see as Roberto develops the argument that therefore we should accept these ideas as stated, but when we do the secularization move, what if we don't simply take out these pieces? What if we take seriously the fact that maybe there are not simple, unchangeable natural laws that govern the universe? What if we take seriously the fact that radical contingency of history absolutely exists? And so instead of secularizing that away, the move is actually to take these seriously and then say, what would we do in the secularization move if we don't simply try to make these things that don't make sense to us disappear?
Now, what is the practical consequence of the scandals of reason? That's the next subject that I want to broach. The practical consequence of the scandals of reasons is the difficulty of faith, how hard it is to believe. And this in turn relates to one of the dominant characteristics now of religion at the present time, which is the diffusion throughout the world of a sentimental will to believe. William James said, people believe as much as they can, and they try and believe as much of this Christian narrative as they can. And what results is something that's like a halfway house between belief and unbelief. That's the dominant characteristic from the standpoint of the history or sociology of religion of the present moment. Now, what's the problem with this halfway house? There are two problems. One is it's self-deception. It's a way in which, desirous of consolation against the incurable flaws in the human condition, our mortality, our groundlessness, and our insatiability, many desperately want to believe. And of course, they're fooling themselves if all they're doing is achieving a form of consolation based on this lie that they tell to themselves, this lullaby. And the history of religion and philosophy is in large part a history of these lullabies, of these forms of consolation. The second problem of the halfway house is that in practice, the halfway house becomes a vehicle for the restatement of the moral and political pieties of the age. The halfway house serves as the instrument by which simply to state what people believe anyway, morally and politically, and to wrap it in this envelope. And of course, that's not what we might want religion to be. We might want it to be like art, a storm that takes us in a direction that we don't want to go, not just some convenient prop with which we steel ourselves against the wounds in the human condition. And so we have reason to suspect, to resist, and to think that faith and atheism are closer to each other in many respects than either of them is to this halfway house. The halfway house is the least acceptable.
Continuing with the commentary, note the argument here. The move being made is when we, the first move, of course, being that when you secularize to take away these things that don't fit our pre-given order, note the dangers. Here, Roberto was also saying, note when we say, oh, okay, but I will actually be a faith believer and believe these things, but often we do it in a way that domesticates in the exact opposite way, which is to say, if I'm going through a difficult time, I'll just tell myself everything will be okay and my faith will help me through, but you're actually not wrestling with the implications of any of the issues we have just discussed. Or conversely, the common institutional order is, why does the world exist as it does? Why is there so much suffering and exploitation? Well, at some level, it must either be, as in the great chain of being, divinely given, or there soon will be, beyond anything I need to worry about doing, some kind of divine fulfillment where everything will be okay. And the argument is, if it's taking, or when it takes that form, you by definition are not living up to the power of these ideas, which are precisely to say, blow apart your current understanding of the world, blow apart everything you think, and open yourself up to some radical rethinking of everything. That is the storm of religion, not everything will be okay, or everything that exists in this current world is either divinely given or will soon be ameliorated, minus anything I need to do. The argument is that's not simply accepting a religion, that is accepting a dangerously domesticated vision of what ought to have been the powerful, what was in fact at certain moments, the powerful implications of these ideas.
Now I come to a positive proposition, and I ask, what then are the central tenets of Christianity? And I want to claim that they are two. There are two ideas: the idea of the infinite, the idea of transcendence on one side, and the idea of the supremacy of love as the organizing principle of moral experience on the other. Let me start with love. So, many of the conventional presentations of Christian ethics make it seem that the essence of Christianity is altruism. And of course, the modern moral philosophers, having heard from Christ that we should love the stranger, and believing that it is impossible to love the stranger, then give us the cold shoulder of proposing to us an impersonal benevolence as the principle of the moral life, which is altruism. And there's a confusion in the presentation of the moral ideas of Christianity, because this is presented as Christian charity, and therefore as on a continuum with love. But I want to claim now that altruism is not love, that altruism is radically different from love in 4 respects. First, altruism is about the sacrifice, the control of self-interest. Love is about mutual respect and recognition, acceptance, the relation between two human beings, established in such a way that my relation to the other reaffirms me in my sentiment of being rather than jeopardizing me and subjecting me to a danger of subjugation. It's a different subject. It's a radically different subject. Second, altruism has no cognitive threshold. The altruist doesn't need to imagine his beneficiary, except to the extent to know what the beneficiary needs and to make a sacrifice on his behalf. But love has a cognitive threshold. And the initial problem in love is to imagine the otherness of the other person. Every other problem in love is secondary to that. And this is a radically different endeavor, moral endeavor. The third is that altruism doesn't presuppose any fundamental equality. Altruism is a gift from on high. The gift may require sacrifice, even sacrifice of one's own life, but it doesn't require that the altruist place himself on the same plane as his beneficiary, as love does. And that then leads to the fourth difference between altruism and love, which that the price of love is a heightening of vulnerability. The lover must throw away his shield, and which the altruist need not do. The altruist may even need to perish in order to consummate his gift, but there's no intimate jeopardy as there is in love. So love is fundamentally different from altruism. And now the other theme of Christianity, the theme of the infinite. God is radically transcendent and then embodied in historical action and in the world. And this same dialectic between transcendence and immanence goes on within every individual human being. I think the deepest theme in Christian theology, the most important question, is what is the relation between these two ideas? The idea of the infinite, the idea of radical transcendence, and the idea of the supremacy of love. How are they related to one another? One could say that it is in love that we are able to recognize and accept one another as the radically transcendent, context-transcending originals that we all ultimately know ourselves to be. We affirm our affinity in our experience of love. But of course, that only highlights that we are not yet these people who are able to radically accept and understand one another in that way. We must make ourselves into them over history. And therein lie the central enigmas of Christian theology. Now, what I next want to say after that is that the history of actual Christian theology is a history of heretical diversions from this idea. All the major Christian theologies from the earliest times after Christ onward are, to one extent or another, departures from this conception of the central relation between the infinite and love. So that if the orthodoxy is that connection, the orthodoxy is like a vanishing horizon. It's not something that is manifest in the history of the religion.
So the opening move of this part of the argument, of course, going back to what we were saying about these early modern conceptions, is that secularization attempt to basically say, let's organize the world of sovereign individuals, each with their own property, and then figure out ways that they will not kill each other, is basically to, number one, reduce love to altruism, as we have discussed, and then number two, of course, reduce the notion of radical transcendent infinity, namely God, and what would occur with the incarnation, and say, well, it's kind of the equivalent of a sovereign having their own property. In other words, you radically reduce any notion of infinity and any notion of transcendence. The opening move here, of course, is to argue, what if we take them seriously? But then the next move Roberto is making is to say, if we really take these seriously, it's not just that we're questioning these early modern secularizations. Actually, most of the forms of Christian theology were also attempts to not wrestle with these, not even failing to wrestle with them, but honestly attempts to not wrestle with these. Hence Roberto's argument that even the standard, most powerful, and most influential moments of Christian theology that ended up defining the religion actually are heretical moves away from the power of truly trying to deal with the implications of radical love, infinity, and transcendence.
So now, just to bear out that claim, to make that claim stick, consider the theme of the infinite and the opposing heresies of which it has been subject in the history of Christian theology. And I'm going to use the device of calling the heresies by the name of individuals. So let me call one of them the Hegelian heresy. So the Hegelian heresy, which early in the history of Christianity was known as Pelagianism, says there's a definitive form of life which incorporates, preserves, sustains everything that we fundamentally need to exist as these radically transcending individuals. So history comes to an end. It has a definitive form. This, I want to say, is a heresy in Christianity. Christianity says there's no institutional arrangement is sufficient. All institutions are dust in the face of God. So the Americans, for example, although professing to be Christian in their majority, are adepts of this Hegelian heresy. In the United States, it takes the form of the cult of the Constitution. So they believe that their country discovered at the time of its inception, of its foundation, the definitive formula of a free society, codified in the Constitution, and that the rest of humanity either subscribes to this formula or continues to vegetate in poverty and despotism. And that's an example of what I'm calling the Hegelian heresy. The opposite of the Hegelian heresy is what you might call the Sartrean heresy, and it's the heresy of Romanticism. So what is the essence of Romanticism? The essence of Romanticism is that there is a contradiction between spirit and structure. Spirit as in romantic love, structure as in the routines of married life. Structure as in the bureaucratic apparatus of the state, spirit as in the mob in the streets. The romantic belief is that we are only truly human. We are only these infinite, transcending individuals in those brief interludes in which we shake the rule of the structures. But the structures will always ultimately come back. After the Cultural Revolution, the state will come back. Interpreted in that way, Romanticism is a form of despair about our ability to change the relation between spirit and structure, and to create a structure that is hospitable to spirit and that splits the difference between spirit and structure. And so the Christian orthodoxy then is this invisible or inaccessible middle position between Romanticism and Hegelianism. And you could make the same kind of argument with respect to the other theme, the theme of love. So the vanishing horizon, the impossibility of describing the form it would take to be compatible with the vision. And that may help explain what I suggested at the outset, that all these more powerful visions deal with Christianity but are unable to state it in what would be in its orthodox form. No, I haven't finished. I have one more proposition. No, but you comment on this, and then I'll say something.
So what is at stake in calling much of Christian theology heretical? One of the key things at stake is the following. We should be critiquing Hegel and all that comes out of Hegel, that entire vision of a pre-given narrative history with a final endpoint where we will all find a happy home, as well as the romantic, and we will see later, Nietzschean version of the radical divinized individual. We should read those not simply as secularized versions of Christianity. What is at stake in this rereading is actually, no, those are heresies that actually come out of earlier heresies, that actually these are very powerful readings of parts of Christian theology, but those parts of Christian theology are heresies. All of these are heretical failures to deal with the key to radical visions, love and transcendent infinity, and the question then is, how would we actually wrestle with these outside of the various heretical attempts to not do so and domesticate them?
Now, just to argue that this is not an argument in favor of abdication, of prostration, that it is possible still to struggle to develop ideas in this direction. Let me attempt that with respect to the idea of freedom. So, and this is a way of expounding one of the dimensions of the contrast today between right and left. The idea that would be to be a progressive or to be a leftist today doesn't mean to defend shallow equality against shallow freedom. That is, freedom and equality against the background of the established institutional arrangements. Shallow equality means you accept the existing market order, the existing low-energy form of democracy, and you imagine it humanized by compensatory redistribution through progressive taxation and redistributive social spending, rather than reorganizing the order. What is the real objective of the progressives? It's that humanity will rise to a higher level, ordinary humanity. We will all become greater, provided that we become greater together and rise to a life with greater scope, more capabilities, more intensity, so that the successor to shallow equality in the ideas of the left is deep freedom, and not a rigid equality of outcome or of circumstance. That's, after all, what Karl Marx and John Stuart Mill both really wanted. They wanted humanity to rise to a higher level of greatness, of shared greatness, of shared bigness. And how should we expound this idea of deep freedom in a way that is responsive to the dreams of Christianity and can be understood by both the believer and the unbeliever, and therefore lay a basis for convergence that crosses the frontier between the sacred and the profane? And here's the proposal that I will make as an example of the kind of operation that I'm suggesting. Freedom consists in the management of a series of contradictions. And let me describe the three crucial contradictions. The first is in the relation of the self to the other. To be free, I have to be connected to someone else, to other people. But every connection threatens me with subjugation. So freedom means connection without subjugation. We have a partial experience of such a connection in personal love. Because in love, we can be connected with someone without losing or diminishing ourselves. On the contrary, the relation to the other reaffirms me in my sentiment of being. But love is impossible in life among strangers. The equivalent to love in the relation among strangers is cooperation. Cooperation among free and equal individuals. The market is one form of cooperation, and the democracy is another. And that's the stuff of struggle in history. The problem is that all the particular forms of the market or of the democracy are flawed and contestable, and the subject of conflict, sometimes violent conflict. Now, second, To be free, I must be able to engage in a particular social world. No one is free alone in the forest. We have to be engaged. But every engagement in a particular world seems to exact from us as the price of engagement that we submit. So to be free, I have to be able to engage in a particular world without submitting to it. I have to be able to deny the last word to that world and keep the last word for myself. I have to be an insider and an outsider at the same time. And so that's the second meaning of freedom. Freedom is the experience of engagement without submission. And that requires then a world which is able to allow its participants to continue to struggle against it. And third, the third dimension of freedom is in my relation to myself. To be free, I have to form a habitual way of being. The Greeks call that character, and they said character is destiny. But I can't allow the character to become rigidified and to suck the life out of me, to become a mask, an icon that takes the life away from me. So I have to be able not just to form a habitual way of being, but to find a way in which to subvert this way of being from within, to break it apart. It forms a mummy around me as I grow older. I have to be able to break out of the mummy. And freedom, therefore, is also this ability to combine the formation of a habitual way of being with its disruption. So what then is freedom? Freedom are these contradictions and our ability to deal with them. And we deal with them in two times: in the biographical time of an individual life and in the historical time of a society. In other words, each of these three kinds of freedom has a moral response in a certain conduct of life, and a political response, a collective response in the organization of society. And that's an example of how we might begin to think about these problems in a way which combines the moral and the political, the biographical and the historical, the secular and the theological. Just to make the argument that it's not a counsel of despair.
And I will conclude my commentary by simply mentioning a few words about the larger terms we've been using to underline the significance of the move that Roberto is making here. I've repeatedly used the word secularization to describe things like early modern philosopher Hegel, etc. Let me say a few words about that. With almost no exceptions, when figures like Hegel, these early modern philosophers, when they have been described as secularizing Christian ideas, almost always that is made in the form of a critique. In other words, you criticize Hegel by saying, oh, this is simply a secularization of Christianity. You criticize Romantic thinking by saying, this is simply a secularization of these other ideas. So a common critique of a lot of these moments is to say, this is just a secularization, the implication being, don't secularize religious ideas, think of something fundamentally different. And tellingly, many of the attempts to support much of modern theory coming from the West has entailed the argument that, oh, no, they just sound like Christian ideas, but they are really not secularization arguments. So Hans Blumenberg will famously say, no, the modern age is legitimate precisely because these are not just secularized ideas. They occupy the same place, as he will say, as some of these ideas did in the pre-modern world, but these are fundamentally different modern ideas. They are not secularized Christian ideas. And the move that Roberto is making is, in essence, to say that's not the problem. The issue is not that these are secularized Christian ideas, it's that they are secularizing from heretical, domesticated versions that you can trace back right to the early theologians. What we really need to be doing is taking the most powerful, radical elements of Christianity, much of which is precisely what was being pushed against once Christianity is reread according to Greek philosophy and then used for those concepts by theology. That's what we are pushing against. Once we can then turn to those extraordinarily powerful ideas, that is what we are trying to secularize, and that leads to a radically different set of ideas than the ones we have come to characteristically call modern Western thought. So what is at stake in this is a radical rejection of the entire set of ideas that have come to define much of Euro-American thinking, and along the way, a radical argument as to what therefore we need to be doing to open up the possibility of finally taking seriously the most powerful ideas that arose in the Christian tradition.
Well, let's open up.
Let us open this up. As always, any comment, question, concern is always welcome. Yes, please.
So in the description of
You have to shout because the mic doesn't work well.
in the description of Christianity, in these more radical, pre-secularized, non-secularized way, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like there's a proposal for re-enchantment of sorts.
For a proposal for
Re-enchantment.
re-enchantment.
And I'm wondering, one, if that's a
What do you mean by re-enchantment?
rejection of the materialism of the early modern Enlightenment period and a reinfusion of the metaphysical or spiritual ways of looking at things, or like say taking seriously the prospect of miracles. So I'm wondering if that's a correct characterization, and if you're suggesting that that would be normatively good, and also related to that, what would be the political, economic, and social implications of taking enchantment in that way seriously?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the connotations of the term re-enchantment. A lot seems to ride on that, right? In your question. The point is that there's no division between the material and the spiritual aspects of our life, and that the organization, and that the question of how do we participate in the divine life, right? The theme of the infinite. We're not like God with respect to the attributes of omnipotence, omniscience, and holiness. But we are like God with respect to the crucial attribute of transcendence. And the basic logic of our existence is this dialectic between transcendence and finitude. That's why I say everything in our existence points beyond itself. Everything is really about something else, something that's beyond it. So how can our lives be organized in a way which testifies to that, which does just so. If by re-enchantment you mean that all of our existence, all of our prosaic, ordinary existence acquires this higher significance, then yes, re-enchantment, if that's what it means.
Yeah, that's basically what I'm referring to. So I'm wondering what would the implications of that be for social organization?
For
Social organization, politics, economics.
well, it's that that there's always this prophetic dimension in politics, right? So when politics is serious, it's always religious. Tocqueville says, every great revolution is both a political revolution and a religious revolution, meaning it's about institutions or structure, and it's about consciousness. As opposed to as opposed to the idea that politics is the realm of cold marginal equities and efficiencies. And that the sublime must be privatized. So the sublime is for the inner conscience. In the realm of the individual sensibility or the individual soul, we can embark on a roller coaster of subjectivist adventurism. But the public realm is the realm of coldness and of these marginal efficiencies. So it's the denunciation of that idea. And that idea is obviously in control of the world.
Yes, please.
I would like to respond to this point because I think it's a very important point. By stating re-enchantment, you're saying that at some point humanity stopped being enchanted. I think the enchantment persists, but the object of enchantment's changed. So for instance, a belief in economics is an enchantment, where you think you can reduce quality of human life and experience through statistical graphs. The belief in progress that only certain idea of leading life is an enchantment. So one of the moves that happens in philosophy is that the religious aspect persists, but the label dissolves. So what is being argued for is to question that which we take on belief. Because all of us believe in some things. Mathematicians start with axioms that they do not prove. So I think the proposal here, which I find very interesting, is to not run away, but question that belief over and over again. And in that, it's not just about creating a dichotomy between enchantment and not enchantment, but finding that we are all always enchanted by some things that we do not question. But instead, what if we start questioning those things again? I think it's a great point that he raised, and that's why I wanted to add on to that.
Because of course, and following up on that, then every particular experience, there's the question of how do we distinguish between transcendence and idolatry? Because we are enchanted by the idols, and our lives are consumed in these attempts at false transcendence.
Can you hear me?
Kind of. Try to speak up. What I can also do is run my microphone to people. So try to speak up, and if we can't hear you, I'll just, yeah.
Okay, excellent.
Thank you. We could take turns, so we'll each get our exercise.
Okay, so on the note of freedom, it is that there must be
You
some
could
sort of-
just speak louder, that's easier.
Why is there necessarily an association with another person or a group in our understanding of how one must?
Because we are radically incomplete. We require the other. We're not these little gods who, on our own planet, suffice unto ourselves. Yes. What substantiates it? That's who we are. I don't deduce that from some rational necessity. There could be another universe in which we would be these self-sufficient deities, but that's not what we are. And we, and love, the supremacy of love is the expression of that. We require to be completed in the other. We're all bound together in the whole world by an invisible circle of longing and love. That's the nature of humanity.
So, just out of
Like curiosity, it feels like a lot of the current kind of Christian tradition and Christian model, you know, has maybe adopted a lot of the secularization, like churches that do food drives but don't allow the homeless to actually attend services, like that kind of thing. Do you feel like right now there is a movement, like a Christian sect or a movement that most closely aligns with that like radical original Christian intent, or have we all kind of moved away from that?
What do you think?
I am not sure, but do you have a suggestion?
Honestly.
Yeah.
I was just curious if there was something, like I think in some ways, like some very specific, like monasteries or like very religious communities maybe have closer to that, but I do think that we've sort of, on the whole, moved in the direction of secularization.
Yeah, I do think you're right, although it's a fascinating question if anyone can think of exceptions to this. But I do think you're right, yes.
I think there's a problem, right, in that the movements or the experiences that are labeled as religious are just a tiny fraction of what one might mean by religion in this discussion. Because religion is not what is called religious. It's not churches and so forth. Religion is intensity, is life. Where there is life, there's religion, there's transcendence. So what's worshipped is life. That's the flame, the eternal flame, and that's what we're talking about as transcendence. How does the individual come to share in this fire? It's the fire of life. And it being labeled religious or not is kind of irrelevant, because that's all part of the control of the spiritual intensity. And the aim really is not to control it, isn't that so?
Yes. Yeah, I agree that it is entirely possible these openings, these fires, these prophetic possibilities could emerge from things we would call religious. They might emerge from something we would never even think of calling religious. They may emerge from movements that would be very strongly opposed to allowing us to call them religious. And I agree, what we should be looking for is the fire, the prophecy, regardless of the category that we or even the participants would want to put on it. Yes.
So there is a question implicit in your remark about how we identify this prophetic fervor, right? If we were to take the model, the historical model, it always involves a combination of visionary teaching with exemplary action. And the prophet makes discoveries about the possible. We could call them epiphanies. And these epiphanies then inform his prophecies. The prophecy is the intimation of a larger form of life. And the prophet has to provide a down payment. The prophet has to provide some foreshadowing of this larger life, and to be able to point to the epiphany as a demonstration. And have it credentialed not just by the visionary teaching, but by the exemplary action. That's prophecy. And it's not necessarily an activity of individuals. It can be a collective activity.
Yes, please, yeah.
I had a question about the half house. I think
The halfway house.
the halfway house. Sorry. I think there are a number of reasons why people end up there. Some of them being faith takes a lot from you, and it's just easier to be in that halfway house. But then I think, to some other degree, and you kind of talk about this when you said it was a vehicle for our own moral pieties,
You don't, right? I mean, it's not saying you can reconcile everything with everything else, but it's taking the religion not as a given, as something to be reinvented. That is, a premise of this whole argument here is the gates of prophecy are always open. Prophecy is not something that happened 2,000 years ago in ancient Palestine. Prophecy is something that happens at any moment, now. And religious revolution. I mean, this axial age business that Jaspers and Max Weber came up with was all modeled on looking for ancestors for them, right? This was after the Second World War. They thought there was an explosion of moral relativism, and they were looking to see the ancestors of their rationalism among the Jewish prophets, among the Greek philosophers, and so they came up with that concept. But it wasn't really about the ancients, it was about them, because they wanted to have this ancient pedigree which they provided themselves with. But prophecy is all of history. I mean, we're now, I think of the United States. So they're the American prophets, right? Like Lincoln, Whitman, Emerson had a certain idea. So Harold Bloom pointed out that there's what he called the American religion. So in the United States, there are three main currents, religious currents. There's traditional Catholicism and Protestantism. The predominant element historically is the Protestantism of the 19th century, which is this privatized form of Christianity. Then there's the secular humanism, which is largely a secularization of Christian piety. And then there's the third thing, which is the religion that the Americans invented, which are like Seventh-day Adventists, Latter-day Saints, Jehovah's Witnesses, to some extent Southern Baptists. The religion that the Americans invented is a particular kind of Christianity. And it has its prophets. And these American prophets of the early 19th century were already adumbrations or expressions, agents of this American religion. So, and then it's not just a fact, you can pass judgment on it. So I would say the central theme of the American religion is the individual isn't just in communion with God. The individual, in a very real sense, is God and participates in the eternal life of God. And now, speaking as a critic of the American religion, I'd say the American religion suffered from two heresies, to use one of our favorite words today. The first was a disturbed sense of the relation between self-construction and solidarity. So the idea of the Americans, of the early 19th century Americans, was the individual first becomes strong, prosperous, rich, empowered. Like a little Napoleon, he puts the crown on his head, and then, having empowered himself in this way, he then becomes generous. This is a perversion. That's not the relation of solidarity to self-fashioning. Solidarity is internal to self-fashioning. It's not a gift of empowerment. It's not something that comes later. And the second heresy of the American religion is institutional idolatry. So the Americans canonized their political and economic institutions. The cult of the Constitution is the extreme example of that. But it's on a spectrum because they applied the same thing to the market order, the particular version of a market economy which they instituted. So is that not a heresy? Of course it is. A Christian has to think all institutional frameworks are dust in the eyes of God. Huh? Some are better than others, but all of them are flawed. How can a Christian accept the idea that there's some definitive institutional home for humanity and that they have it? They found it. They show it to the rest of humanity. That's monstrous. So it's not enough then to say the ideals, the message of the American prophets hasn't been implemented. The message has to be corrected of the American prophets. And there has to be a religious struggle in the country, which then runs in parallel to the other forms of struggle. So it's not just like religion is some kind of moralistic beating of the drums in preparation for something that's going to come later. It's part of the essential thing. So, and then, isn't that something that has to go on now?
I mean, maybe I'm not fully understanding, but are you saying that there are certain parameters of what is acceptable prophecy and not?
No, I'm not saying that. No, I'm saying that the country was formed by a particular history and by a particular form of consciousness. So in the South there was a slave regime, and in the North there was an economy of petty proprietors and artisans. Only one white man in 5 worked for another white man. It was a petty bourgeois economy with a small elite on top and a great majority of these little people. And then they created a religion, this American religion, which corresponded to that. So now the struggle has, now that there has to be a political struggle, because now there's this insular knowledge economy in the country, which a small elite is in control of the vanguard of production. Everyone else in the country is consigned to some kind of make work. There's a class of paper pushers and lawyers and accountants serving this economic elite. Everyone else is down in nothing. So the transformation of the structure has to run in parallel with the struggle over consciousness. And then all these things from the 19th century come back in a new form. That's the argument.
Okay, I was wondering, so in this, I guess, debate between like love versus, or not debate, but like the separation between love and altruism, it seems like they are very distinct concepts where like love is, like you said, more personal and vulnerable, but altruism lets you go, like, lets you take a more superior position. So then I was wondering why we tend to get them like mixed up in a way, and why they are intertwined. If by like,
Yeah, feel free to use this.
thanks. Wow.
I'm not sure why, but yeah.
Thanks. Basically, I was just wondering why it is that we tend to confuse love and altruism with each other, if they seem to be pretty distinct concepts.
Why we confuse one with the other? Michael?
Yeah, I would say, going back to one of the things mentioned earlier, both really do come out of these earlier Christian ideas, but they are reading very different parts of the Christian tradition. So the whole vision of altruism, which, as Roberto has argued, is really not a modern secular idea. I mean, you can absolutely trace that back to Christian notions of charity, but in that version of Christianity, this is simply saying you maintain the world as it exists, or the secularized version of modernity, you maintain the world of sovereign individuals who then simply have altruistic concern for each other, so it isn't simply a purely man-eat-man world. So there's some concern for helping those around one. And the counter-argument to that is the concept that underlies that is, in fact, love. So it's not a radically different concept in that sense. These aren't two unrelated concepts. It's that charity, and then altruism later, is a radical domestication of love. And then think of love as not, we will largely maintain the world as it exists with some minor attempts to ameliorate it. So if I become a wealthy bourgeois sovereign, I'll give a little bit of my property, a little bit of my wealth to those who are impoverished. The notion of love actually would radically push against my notion of sovereignty. It would be, I would have to be incredibly vulnerable vis-a-vis the world. I would be forced to drop my sense that I am this self-sufficient sovereign with my own property, that I'll give up a slight bit to the others, and that we're arguing.
So that's connected with this theme of Christianity that you have to cast down your shield.
Yes, exactly.
So
that's not accepting the world as it largely is. It is.
So it's the
destroying
opposite
sovereignty.
of the Stoic idea that the soul is a fortress against misfortune, against the danger. You have to throw open the fortress. This is the paradoxical message of Christianity. Now, I think it's important to place this conversation we're having in the larger context here and explain something about the situation of the Course and of humanity now at the moment. So I briefly referred to this in the first class. So we're living through a long revolutionary period in the history of humanity, the last 200 or 300 years. The world's on fire. And this fire has two sides, one political and one personalist. The political side are the doctrines of socialism, communism, democracy, liberalism, promising to lift the grid of division and hierarchy weighing on humanity. The other side is the personalist, and it's especially carried by the worldwide popular romantic culture, with its message that the ordinary human being is not so ordinary after all, and is called to ascend to a higher form of life. Now, this project, this revolutionary project, remains the most powerful project in the world. It has many enemies, but all of its enemies respond to it. It continues to control the agenda. But it's in a paradoxical situation. It's both strong and weak. It's strong because it remains the project that commands the agenda, but it's weak because its defenders no longer know what its next steps should be, on either the political side or the personalist side. So I see our arguments here in this course as being about the next steps on the personalist side, the conduct of life. The other arguments would be about the reorganization of the economy, the reorganization of democracy, the next steps on the institutionalist side. That's the whole situation. Now, I also think that I and we are living in what I hope will be a counter-revolutionary interlude. in this long revolutionary period in the history of humanity. And so I want the revolution to continue on both sides, on the personalist side and on the political side. And so one of the objectives of this discussion is to cultivate the ideas and the emotions that allow the revolution to reemerge after this period of hibernation and restraint. That's the objective. And of course, the objective is subject to all of the practical divisions, because after all, this is a course in a school. And so it's a fantasy that from this we have a revolution, but that's how we have to think. So we have to disregard the practical limitations and forget that it's just a course, meeting for 2 hours once a week. And so it's absurd to think that this is a revolution. But that's how we have to think.
Indeed, and with apologies to about 3 hands at least that are up that we unfortunately won't have time to get to today, but don't worry, we have many more weeks to go. Let me say just very briefly, as this absurd attempt continues, next week we will jump to South Asia. We will look at the rise of the Upanishads and the Buddha. We will look at these very, very different attempts to completely destroy our assumptions of the self and the world around us. And here too, we will try to work out the implications of how to read these extraordinary ideas. Thank you so much, and see you next week.
But it went a little beyond the limits of what a class.
Only slightly.
Harvard Law School, Harvard Business School.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for the presentation.
Total pleasure.
If I understood correctly, our course mostly grappled with historical dead ends of a certain branch of Christianity, the Protestant branch. How about the Catholic or the Orthodox branches?
Oh, how about the Catholic and Orthodox branches, along with the Protestant branches we
I think there are many aspects of orthodoxy that are attractive. And theologians. One of my favorites is
Absolutely. So sorry about not getting to your question.
Oh, that's okay. I'll ask tomorrow, not this
Okay,
hours.
good.
Yeah. Okay.
Say that it's
Yeah,
promising.
absolutely. See you
There are
tomorrow.
promising aspects to it.
No, I think there are many interesting aspects. I think, and there's one philosopher in the West who reenacts some of the themes of Orthodox Christianity. Nicholas of Cusa. Very, very interesting. So, for example, Nicholas of Cusa says, an individual can only become himself by becoming God. You know? And Maximus the Confessor says,
Super famous one.
yeah,
He's a pillar.
Maximus the Confessor says, the individual, man becomes God by grace, God becomes man by condescension through the incarnation and so forth. So these themes of the interaction of the infinite and the finite are profound in Orthodox.
And I dropped you an email last week about office hours. I couldn't do last Wednesday, but I may be able to do this Wednesday.
Okay, are you Sebastian or you?
I'm from SKS.
Oh yeah. So what's your name again?
Nicholas Neres.
Oh yes, Nicholas.
You're
yes,
from
yes,
where?
Yes. So
From where did you say you are?
From SKS, but I'm from Greece.
From Greece.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking about Orthodox Christianity.
Orthodox, yes.
So, but wonderful. Yep. Next Wednesday will work. If not, drop me an email. We can find another time too.
What
So
time
that's
are
fine
your
too.
office hours again?
Oh, so the Wednesday's 3 to 5. Wonderful. Great. See you there.
Thank you, sir.
It's good that we have it all on videotape.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I
Hey,
emailed, but
yes,
she's also
indeed.
sticking around.
Absolutely.
I have to run.
Absolutely. See you very soon.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I should mention immediately, we did make a typo in the paper topic. So, so instead of 3 to 6 pages, it's 300 to 600. Two drops,
Right, yes,
two
of
O's, of course, of course.
Yes.
So yeah, 300 to 600 pages. Yeah, of course. I mean,
Yes.
you probably read that, of course.
Right, yeah, I was already 100 pages in. you
Oh,
know, I'm-
exactly.
yeah.
And you're just thinking, how do I stop at 600 pages? Hello?
Yes, exactly, yes.
Exactly. Absolutely. So yeah, that's a given. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, I think that I just wanted to clarify,
Of course.
like, I think I'm writing about the first prompt,
Fantastic.
and just making sure that, like, the cognitive gap I'm talking about, like, we have an assumption of a market, we have an assumption of a bunch of different things, and thus it makes it almost impossible for us to kind of overcome that,
Yes.
because we're walking into this assuming
Yes.
what philosophy is.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
So-
Yeah, that sounds wonderful.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect. I just need to
Yes.
come up with a claim about that. Because right now that's just a bunch of thoughts. But that makes, because the other question was, what, this is maybe a softball, but what is the school of philosophy? For the second
Oh,
question?
so basically, we're really thinking about what we were talking about last week. So
Okay.
think of the school of philosophy as what Parfit was talking about.
Okay.
Like simply saying, okay, let's create these artificial situations.
Right.
And think of ethics as simply which of these 3 procedural ways will allow us to solve our ethical problems.
Okay.
So, in other words, you don't ask what are the underlying assumptions about what we're like as human
Okay.
beings, the world we've created. You literally cut that out